The wind carried a low whistle across the dry plains as the stagecoach rattled into the little frontier town of Red Creek, its wheels kicking up dust that swirled like spirits rising from the earth, and the lone cowboy standing near the hitching post squinted against the golden sunlight as he waited, his hat tilted low and his jaw tense, because this day was one he had thought about for months but could never quite picture in his mind. He had sent away for a bride, not out of desperation but out of a quiet, aching loneliness that pressed on him every night when the ranch house echoed with silence and the stars looked down with pity, and when the driver finally pulled the reins and the horses slowed, the cowboy's chest tightened because he knew that inside that carriage was the woman meant to change the course of his life. The door creaked open, and at first, all he saw was a small hand clutching the frame, then a bonnet dipped low, and finally a slender figure stepping down with hesitation, her shoulders trembling under the weight of whatever burdens she carried, and when she lifted her face for just a brief moment, he saw eyes rimmed with tears, cheeks streaked where she had already been crying for miles, lips pressed as though she was trying to keep herself from falling apart in the middle of strangers, and the cowboy's heart did something he wasn't prepared for, it broke before he even knew her name. She tried to offer a polite smile, one of those practiced expressions a woman wears when she has no choice but to appear strong, but her lips quivered and her gaze dropped to the ground, and he stepped forward, removing his hat with a gentleness that contrasted the rugged lines of his face, and he said, in a voice that was low but steady, "Ma'am, you don't have to pretend with me." The words hung in the warm air, startling her enough that her eyes flicked back to his, wide with surprise, because she had expected judgment or disappointment or maybe even cold indifference, but instead, she saw kindness etched into his gaze, an understanding that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and though she wanted to keep her defenses, something inside her cracked, and another tear slid down her cheek before she quickly brushed it away. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice thin like a thread about to snap, "I didn't mean to," but she couldn't finish, and he shook his head softly, cutting her apology short with nothing more than the curve of his words, "Don't be sorry. You came all this way. That tells me enough about the strength you've got." He offered his hand, rough from years of rope and reins, yet steady as an anchor, and after a hesitant pause, she placed her trembling fingers in his palm, and the connection, simple as it was, sent something unexplainable through both of them, a sense that maybe this union was not just an arrangement on paper but the beginning of healing wounds that neither of them had spoken aloud yet. The townsfolk watched quietly, some with curiosity, others with whispers about the cowboy who had sent for a mail-order bride, but he didn't care about their eyes or their words, he only cared about making sure the woman beside him didn't feel like a stranger abandoned in a land too vast for her sorrow, so he guided her gently toward his waiting horse and wagon, lifting her bag as though it weighed nothing, though he could tell by the scuffed leather and worn straps that it carried everything she had left of her life back east. She climbed onto the wagon seat with careful grace, still glancing around as though uncertain if she belonged, and he joined her, flicking the reins to set the horses in motion, the town fading behind them while the endless horizon opened before them, a painting of wild grasses and distant mountains that seemed to whisper promises of freedom and hardship in equal measure. Silence stretched between them at first, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that waits, patient, knowing words will come when hearts are ready. He let her take in the land, the open skies, the sound of hooves striking rhythm against earth, until finally, she spoke, her voice fragile but carrying traces of the strength she was slowly remembering. "I didn't know it would feel this far," she murmured, almost to herself. "Back home, everything was close, the streets, the people, here, it feels like the world just keeps going." He glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's the West," he said. "It's wide, it's unforgiving, but it'll teach you things you never thought you could carry. And you won't have to carry them alone anymore." She turned her head, caught off guard by his quiet promise, and for a fleeting second, hope flickered in her tear-stained eyes, though she quickly looked away as if afraid to let herself believe too soon. By the time they reached his ranch, the sun had dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold, and the wooden house stood against the horizon like a sentinel, weathered but strong, much like the man who built it with his own 2 hands, and when he helped her down from the wagon, she hesitated at the front steps, her fingers clutching her skirt, her breath catching as though the reality of her new life had finally settled heavy on her shoulders. He noticed her stillness and didn't rush her. Instead, he stood beside her, hat in hand, letting her see that he was not a man eager to force or demand but one willing to wait until she was ready to take her first step. When she finally lifted her chin, her eyes met his again, and though fear still lingered there, so did something else, a spark of trust, fragile but real, and together, they walked into the house that would either remain a stranger's shelter or become, with time and care, the home of two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of ways. The fire was already lit in the hearth, casting a glow across the room, and she stood in the doorway, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and leather, her heart caught between the pain she had left behind and the uncertain hope rising before her, and he, watching her carefully, said softly, "This place is yours now, same as it is mine. You don't need to be anyone but yourself here." Her tears returned, but this time they carried less sorrow and more release, as though his words had unlocked something she had kept buried too long, and when she finally nodded, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand, he knew this was only the beginning, that the journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs to walk together, one step, one breath, one heartbeat at a time. And so, as the night settled over the plains and the stars stretched across the heavens, two strangers sat by the fire in quiet companionship, each nursing their hidden wounds, each daring to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, they had been led to this place, to this moment, to each other, not by chance but by a hand greater than their own, and though neither spoke it aloud, they both felt it deep within. This was the start of something that could heal them both, if only they had the courage to let it. The morning sun crept over the hills, casting a golden wash across the cowboy's ranch, and when the bride awoke in the small but warm room he had prepared for her, she sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wooden floorboards as if they might tell her how to start this new life. Her heart still torn between the grief that had driven her westward and the fragile hope she had felt when he had spoken those unexpected words the day before, "You don't have to pretend with me." For so long she had worn masks, keeping her sorrow hidden behind polite smiles, carrying losses too heavy for her slender frame, and though she was still a stranger in his home, something inside whispered that perhaps she could rest here, if only for a while. Downstairs, she heard the soft clatter of pans, the sound of a man who wasn't used to sharing his table with anyone but who was trying anyway, and when she finally gathered courage to descend, she found him at the stove, frying eggs with a seriousness that almost made her laugh, though the sound caught in her throat before it could escape. He glanced up, his rugged face softening when he saw her, and he offered a nod as if to say good morning without words, because words, he knew, were fragile things at first, and sometimes silence said more. She sat quietly at the table, folding her hands, and he placed a plate before her, nothing fancy, just eggs and bread, but it felt like more than a meal, it felt like an offering, a gesture that said she belonged here, if she wanted to. She whispered a thank you, her voice still trembling, and he shrugged as though it was nothing, but the truth was, it meant everything to him to see her take that first bite, to know that maybe she could find nourishment here, not just for her body but for the parts of her soul that had gone hungry for kindness too long. The days that followed stretched like unspooling thread, each one weaving them closer in ways neither had expected. She would walk the fields with him, her skirts brushing against tall grasses, watching him work with quiet admiration as he tended cattle, repaired fences, or led the horses with a patience that spoke volumes about the man he was, and in turn, he would watch her discover small joys, like the way she paused to breathe in the scent of wildflowers or knelt by the creek to trail her fingers through the cool water, as if reminding herself she was alive. At night, they would sit by the fire, not always speaking, sometimes just listening to the crackle of wood, and though silence lingered, it was no longer the silence of strangers but of two souls learning to rest in each other's presence. Still, the shadows of her past clung tightly, and more than once, he noticed tears streaking her cheeks when she thought he wasn't looking, the kind of tears born from wounds too deep to heal overnight, and each time, he wanted to reach out, to tell her she didn't need to hide them, but he knew patience was the only bridge that could carry her across the river of sorrow she was trapped in. It wasn't until a storm rolled in one late afternoon that her walls finally began to crumble, the thunder shook the windows, the rain lashed against the roof, and the sound seemed to unravel something inside her, pulling her back to memories she had tried to bury, memories of the family she had lost to fever, the home that had emptied overnight, The loneliness that had driven her into the arms of this arrangement with a man she had never met. She sat by the fire with her arms wrapped around herself, trembling not from cold but from grief, and when he entered the room after securing the barn doors against the wind, he found her weeping openly, her face hidden in her hands. He didn't speak at first, he simply crossed the room and sat beside her, his presence steady, his silence saying more than words could. Finally, she choked out between sobs, "I thought I could start over, but everywhere I look, I see what I've lost. I feel like a fraud, pretending I can be someone's wife when I can barely hold myself together." Her voice cracked, and she covered her face again, ashamed of her own weakness. He reached out then, placing a hand on hers, firm and grounding, and when she lifted her tear-streaked gaze to his, he spoke the words she hadn't known she was desperate to hear, "You don't have to pretend strength for me. You don't have to be perfect. I didn't ask for a woman without scars, I just prayed for someone brave enough to keep living in spite of them. And that's who you are." The truth of his words cut through her like lightning, sharp but illuminating, and she broke down completely, crying into his chest as he held her with a tenderness that contradicted every rough edge of his life, his hand gently stroking her hair, his heart beating steady against her ear as if to remind her that she was not alone anymore. That night, something shifted, though no vows had yet been spoken beyond the letters that bound them, though their union had not yet been sealed by anything more than circumstance and kindness, they both knew they had crossed a threshold, moving from strangers bound by arrangement to companions bound by truth. From then on, she began to let him in piece by piece, sharing stories of her past, her laughter timid but real when she remembered happier days, her tears unhidden when she spoke of the losses that had driven her west, and he, in turn, began to share his own truths, the brother he had buried years ago, the loneliness that had haunted him since, the quiet hope that maybe God had not forgotten him when this woman arrived at his doorstep. Their hearts stitched together slowly, like a quilt made of torn fragments, each patch imperfect, but when placed side by side, creating something whole and unexpectedly beautiful. Seasons turned on the plains, the heat of summer gave way to the crisp bite of autumn, and with it came harvests, hard work, and nights spent closer by the fire. She learned the rhythm of ranch life, her hands growing stronger with each chore, her laughter freer with each passing day, and he found himself smiling more, speaking more, his once solitary life now colored with her presence. Neighbors began to notice the change in him, the cowboy who had always kept to himself now seen at town gatherings with a woman on his arm, her eyes brighter than when she first arrived, her hand resting comfortably in his. Whispers faded into quiet approval, and the townsfolk who had doubted their union began to see that what had begun as an arrangement was blossoming into something far deeper. Still, their journey wasn't without trials. A long drought threatened the cattle, sickness swept through a neighboring ranch, and one night, when a stray wolf prowled near the barn, he had to drive it off with nothing but his rifle and grit, leaving her shaken by the reminder of how wild and unforgiving the West could be. Yet through each trial, they faced it together, and each time, their bond grew stronger, forged like iron in the fire of hardship. It was on a clear winter night, the stars sharp and endless above them, that he finally turned to her as they stood on the porch, their breath visible in the cold air, and he spoke the words he had carried for months. "I know we started this life because of paper and ink, because of letters and arrangements, but what we've found, it's more than that. I don't want you to stay here because you feel you have to. I want you here because you choose it. Because you choose me." She stared at him, tears brimming once more, but these were not born of sorrow, they were born of love, raw and overwhelming. "I do choose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I came here because I had nothing left, but now I see, I came here to find you." He drew her close then, his arms wrapping around her as if to shield her from every storm, and beneath the canopy of stars, their lips met in a kiss that sealed not just their marriage but their hearts, binding them in a love neither had dared to dream of when their story began. From that night forward, they were no longer two souls carrying separate burdens, they were one, walking side by side across the wide and wild land, their love a lantern burning steady against the winds of life. And though hardships would come, as they always do in a world as untamed as the West, they knew they could face them together, because the truth had set them free. She no longer had to pretend, and he no longer had to be alone. Together, they had found home. Not in a house of wood and stone, but in each other's arms, where every tear was met with tenderness, and every scar was seen not as weakness but as proof of survival, proof of love, proof of grace.